Hey guys, it's Michael. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and welcome to a new video. Many of you out there only know one way of programming, and that is starting with a certain split. And that is also why a lot of you guys are always asking, Michael, what is the best split? And the approach that I and we're in our coaching and also most competitive athletes are using is a different way of thinking training. So what we're not doing is we're starting with structuring the week into body part splits like pull, push, upper, lower, push, pull, legs and stuff like that. What we are using is a so-called primary, secondary, tertiary or beyond day system. And why that system is super useful for competitive athletes and how you can use it is what you learn in this video of the programming series. Okay, let's start with the conventional approach. What you would do if you write a program is you set up a split, because that's what people do. So you go with Monday upper, Tuesday lower, and so on. Then you repeat after one day rest, upper, lower, and then you're setting up your exercises. Okay, I'm a competitive athlete in weighted calisthenics, so I need to do dips, pull-ups or chin-ups, muscle-ups and squats. That means on the upper days, I do the upper body lifts. On the lower body days, I do the lower body lift. Now, that comes with a lot of boundaries because you are now having always a frequency of 2. It's hard to get more practice in. You have 3 upper body lifts that you need to fit in somehow into the upper body days. You just have the squat on the lower body days. So it's just not a very good system to use for competitive athletes. And it kind of limits your way of thinking training to this pretty narrow shoebox of upper, lower or push, pull, legs. So what we want to do is widen our perspective, and we can do that with implementing primary, secondary and tertiary days. What we're doing here is we're starting within the exercise itself. So the idea is that we're taking each competitive lift and we're categorizing it into a primary day for that certain lift, which is a very competition specific day. We want to then also add a secondary day for that lift, which is still pretty competition specific, but not as competition specific as the primary day. And then depending on how much practice, volume and frequency we need for that certain lift, for that also check the older videos of that programming series, we can use tertiary or beyond days, which are not that competition specific anymore. And how do we categorize something into competition specific and less specific is with 3 main categories. The first one is the movement itself, second one is the load, and the third one is the environment. As in that programming series, we're always using the dip example. We're now going to set up a dip for primary, secondary and tertiary days. And to understand how we can do that, we're using our 3 different categories. First of all, movement, less specific to very competition specific. So for our primary days, we want to have the competition lift itself. So in our case, that is a competition dip. That means we are using all competition rules and we're working with exactly the same style of dips that we are doing in the competition itself. That would be our primary day dip. Secondary day, we still want to work very competition specific, but we can add some variation to it, maybe bias a certain weakness. So here we're gonna go with a competition dip variation. It doesn't necessarily need to be a variation, but it's often used like that. That's why we're using this example here. And tertiary days means we're less specific, and that could be something like a bench press, it could be an overhead press, but it could also be a ring dip. Something that is not very specific towards the competition dip, but still offers a great carryover to that movement itself. Second category is load. Primary days, we always want to work competition specific. That means we want to have high loads, usually bigger than 80 to 85% 1 rep max in a range of 1 to 5 repetitions. So close to our 1 rep max, we're really forcing that 1 rep max strength adaptation for competition. Secondary days can be a bit lighter, but they don't need to be lighter because we actually have we can add a load constraint due to that variation here. So for the secondary days, it's a bit more moderate, but it doesn't need to be like that. So you can also work heavy with that competition dip variation on the secondary day. Kind of depends on the phase you're in. Like if you're in a peaking phase, you will most likely also work very heavy on the secondary days. If you're more in your off season, like far away from that competition, you can also work more moderate here, like in ranges between 5 and 8 or something. So does not need to be like that, but usually primary and secondary days are pretty similar in the loading range, just the variation differs a bit. And then we have the tertiary days, and here we are working definitely more moderate. So it's usually more hypertrophy orientated, so we are in that range between 60 and 80% 1 rep max, more likely towards the 60% range. And if we're working with those exercises, we also want to have them in a bit higher rep range just to accumulate more training volume if we're working pretty heavy here. And then we're having the last category, that is environment. Here, primary days, competition style. That means we're working with exactly the same competition the same equipment that we have in competition. So squatting in a low bar fashion, if you squat on competition day in low bar fashion, you're gonna wait until you get that signal, you're gonna squat to depth, and so on. So you wanna make everything as specific for the competition as possible. On secondary days, you can be then a bit less specific. As we said, you can use a pause here. You may not need to think about commands. You may not need to hit depth perfectly because you're in a variation. And then for tertiary days, you don't need to be very specific with the environment. You can use different kinds of equipment and so on and so on. And in those 3 categories, we're now putting in the primary, secondary, and tertiary day exercise variations. Now, as I said in the beginning of the video, we are using that system to set up the exercise over the course of a week. And we're now doing so for our dip example, and I'm going to use a similar approach that you can also see in all the videos where I prepared for the German Championships. So if you go back to the other videos of this programming series, you will also see a couple of styles with how setting up RPEs, how setting up reps and so on that we're now going to use also here. So if you haven't seen all the videos, make sure to get them in. So what we are going to do now is setting up the dip over the course of a week, with Monday being our primary session, Wednesday being our secondary session, and Saturday being our tertiary session. So in the case of my competition dip, together with my coach, shout out to Lois, my co-trainer here at King of Weighted, who programmed that for me. What we did on Monday was that we always did a heavy top set. We started with reps of 5, 10 weeks out, and then we tapered that down to singles. I also explained that in a different video. So we're just now taking out a random week of that competition prep. Can definitely be a bit different here. So in that case, we are doing a heavy triple as a top set. So we're going pretty heavy here. So something at 7. Then we had 3 back offsets reps of 5. So we want to work pretty specific here at 7, just random. As you can check the older videos on how to set up RPEs, because that's just now 1 week example. But as you see here, we're working pretty competition specific, heavy ranges, and the exercise was competition dips. So I dip with sleeves as I did in the competition. I try to always dip to depth that I need in competition. I try to get my commands in my head, so waiting a bit until I go down. So that was my primary dips day on Monday. Secondary day, we worked with competition dip with a load constraint. Comp dip with load constraint, and that, I can't write, that was a paused dip in my case, and there we also worked pretty heavy and specific. And I think if I remember correctly, we worked with a 3 times 5, and then we tapered that down over time to, I think, a 4 times 3 or something. I need to go back in that prep, but something around that with a 1 second pause on the bottom. And that was my secondary dips day. And on my tertiary day, in the case of that, we go with a high volume dip session, and that was 3 times 7 that we did, and that was also comp dips. But I was usually pretty sloppy with the execution, going a bit faster, just getting the volume in. And that was the structure that we used. And here, by the way, very important, it was light, very light session. And here the RPE average that we worked was something at 5 to 6, more towards to the side of 5. So very, very low. And what that was, to just get you the idea, is that Saturday session was what you call a primer session. What does that mean? It means if I work heavy here, I also work kind of heavy here, then I have a lot of rest with no training until that session here. And in that session, I need to perform. I want to be ready, so I want to be trained, but I do not want to be super exhausted, but still in a high training state. And what you can do is you can put on your tertiary days, you can put in a very light session. So higher reps, 7, which already guarantees moderate loads because you cannot work super heavy weights for 7 reps. And then combine that with a lower RPE to just get some practice in. And that session will prepare you, but will not make you tired for your primary session here. So that style works pretty good for an in-season competition peaking. And if you're more in the off-season range, what you can do is on your primary days is still go with a setup like this, working pretty specific. On your secondary days, you can work with something like a 3 times 6, maybe with a load constraint, so a bit in the higher range, or you can also work with a top set and a back offset system, but just in a more moderate range, going more hypertrophy orientated. On your tertiary days, you can implement like more of an assistance work, so we can go with bench here, we can go with an overhead press, or as I said, you can also go with ring dips here. And what you're now doing is you're repeating that for every competition exercise that you have and that you want to get better in. And then you mix that up over your week. And then you try to make those days in a way that you're always working basically the tertiary, prepares the secondary, prepares the primary, and so on, so that each training day supplements the next in that order. And with that, you can really build up super complex training programs in a very, very easy way, because you just start with one exercise and you do that for all the other exercises, and then you just put them together. And if you're now thinking, oh, that sounds complicated, go back to my older video where I prepare how we did that for my competition prep. So you can see how we structured the days, Mondays as a primary dip day, tertiary muscle up day, and so on and so on. It's all explained in that video, because I know it's always good to just have one example. Like, there is not much it needs, just one example that you see, okay, this is how it could work. And then you can, go with your own variation from that initial program. So definitely check out the old video. If you are now someone who said, like, I'm not too much into competition training, but I'm still super interested in that system, in my book, Understanding Calisthenics, I developed a bit of an adapted way of this programming style for calisthenic skills. You will find that system in the lever skill section. It's explained with sample programs and how you can set this up for combining static skills like the front lever and planches with weighted calisthenics as the progress backup, which is a pretty interesting system to use, works great. And you can find that here, because I know not all of you are competitive athletes.